Hey everybody, it's Mike from Profiling Evil, and it's Pioneer Days in Utah, and that's why I'm wearing this hat. Once a year, I put this thing on. Now, this is a really special time of year for me because it reminds me each year of my great great grandmother named Jane McKechnie Walton. She was a Scottish immigrant that came across to the United States, and 131 years ago today, she was murdered at a town celebration. It ended up becoming the day that Utah's statehood is celebrated. Now, Jane was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and at the age of 6, her mother joined the Latter day Saint faith, moving down to Liverpool, England to catch a boat and make their way on a 3-month journey across the Atlantic Ocean in a wooden steamboat. In there, they had people who died. You can read all about it in my book, She Knew No Fear. And folks, let me be really clear. I'm trying to get you to look at my book, She Knew No Fear. It's about Jane's life and it's about her murder and how I solved it 130 years later. I think you're going to enjoy it, but I wanted to give you just a little bit of insight into her life. You see, Jane and her family made their way down to Liverpool from Edinburgh, Scotland. And when they were in Edinburgh and they joined the Latter day Saint faith, they moved. She was 6 years old. They made their way across the Atlantic Ocean on a wooden steamship. It took them more than 3 months to get across there. And you can read all about their journey, about the people that died, and the encounters that they had at sea, which are pretty dang cool. Once they got to America, they landed in New Orleans, and it was there that they started to make their way up the Mississippi River, past St. Louis, and into winter quarters, a place where they joined a whole bunch of other people who made their way across that great pioneering trail across the United States, many of them barefoot across the plains, where they had fights with Native Americans and they struggled with life and death. Well, once they made it to Salt Lake, she started to grow up. And by about age 18, she got married and moved to the farthest north end of Utah. There, she and her husband received a call from the Latter day Saint Church to go to a place called Bluff down in the Four Corners area. The idea was that the state of Utah was a territory at the time preparing for statehood. They wanted to have people living in as many areas as they could so they could claim that as the geographic boundary for what would become the state of Utah. Now, they were sending them into incredibly rough country. And in the book, you're going to read about how they went and why they went through an area called the Grand Escalante. It's now a national park. But back then, it was just plain rugged terrain, still is. But along the way, they had so many amazing encounters that you're going to be just blown away. Now, when they got to the hole in the rock, they ended up having to build a road into the hillside. It was a terribly difficult thing. Now, the whole idea of this San Juan area, again, as I said, was to establish settlements for statehood, to protect the area from all the outlaw things that were going on, and to improve relationships with the Native Americans. They called them Indians back then, and so I'm going to refer to it that way. Now, they were being influenced by their church and church leaders who wanted to expand and grow the church. They also wanted to obtain large usable pieces of land. And on the image here on the screen, you can see this is the hole in the rock, and this is what they found when they made their way there. It was really a surprising thing. But let's watch this video and learn a little more.
Hello, I'm Gerald Lund. As a writer and educator, I love finding and telling great stories. Years ago, I heard an account of the Hole in the Rock Pioneers, a tenacious band of Utahns who blasted their way through this small notch and blazed a road across the southern Utah desert to begin a new life in an unknown and dangerous part of the territory. As they traveled across the harsh, unexplored landscape, they met an elderly Ute Indian who inquired how the caravan of wagons had arrived at that very isolated location. When he was told the route they had traveled, he threw up his hands in disbelief, for surely no one could accomplish such a task. I think many of the pioneers were inclined to agree with him, yet they did it. They accomplished an impossible mission, and in doing so left a legacy not only for their families, but for anyone that has faced tough situations and had to make hard decisions. Theirs is a tale of endurance, ingenuity, miracles, courage, faith, and hope. So join me as we learn of the Utah pioneers who forged a road through some of the most rugged and inhospitable terrain on the earth. In the Hole in the Rock expedition.
Well, there are some really cool points of interest along the way, and if you go back and look at the map that I'm going to put in the link below, you can kind of explore a little further the route that they took. But get online also and look up Hole in the Rock and learn a little bit more about it. Their first stop was a place called 10 Mile Springs, a place where they could water the animals and really start to get some rest. They then went on to one of my favorite spots to stop, which is called Devil's Garden. It is amazing, and you can see these outcroppings of rock and other really cool things in the area that people were taking advantage of seeing when they were there. Further down the road, 14 miles down the road, they hit 20 Mile Spring. It's a place that's now called Colette Wash. Incredible rock features, great place to hike. If you're ever out in Utah, make sure that you go to the Grand Escalante staircase and look around. They ended up at a place that is so fun to visit called Dance Hall Rock, and it was there that they held all kinds of dances and other events. It was a place where they got together to keep their morale up. And as you get into Dance Hall Rock, the way it is structured is kind of like a big amphitheater, and the sound just echoes through the area. Let's watch this video clip.
And so in October 1879, 250 settlers, mostly young families with small children, began leaving their communities. The comfortable houses, farms, orchards, friends, and everything they had worked so hard to obtain were left behind to forge a new life on an unknown frontier. From Parowan, Cedar City, St. George, and other southern Utah settlements, they began to make their way toward a new home along the San Juan River.
Not all of the early settlers of the San Juan Mission actually came from southern Utah. In fact, my ancestors, Jane and Charles Walton, came from the northeast corner of the territory from a little place called 10 Mile Creek. Charles had a visit from several of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who issued a call to serve as a clerk to the Hole in the Rock party as they traveled south.
Groups began leaving Parowan and Cedar City in mid-October, knowing that they would be meeting up somewhere along the trail. They reached Escalante and then headed off along the Kaparowitz Plateau, and at Dance Hall Rock, they all met up in late November to discuss their options on the trail.
Dance Hall Rock was in between Escalante and the Colorado River. It was a big landmark for everybody who came into the territory. It was a big, huge rock that had been carved out by the wind, and it was perfect for dances, for meetings, for people to gather. The floor was really hard because it was sandstone, and so when they would play and dance on this, the fiddle music would kind of echo off the walls. It was a fantastic place for them to have fun, relax, and have their special meetings.
From the book, you're going to read about how Jane talked about there was a caravan of wagons, people, livestock stretched for 2 miles long as they made their way down. It was almost 60 miles down to Dance Hall Rock. These people were tough, and they were going across really rugged country. She said that every foot of the journey was over a rock. From time to time, they'd hit a small patch of sand and dirt that would cushion the horses' hooves and make the wagon ride just a little bit more bearable. Now, scouts had pre-approved the route, but what they learned once they got there and found out they were trapped against this 2,000-foot cliff was that they never could have gotten through there. That many of the people wanted to turn back because winter weather was closing in on them. But the group decided to pray and figure out what they wanted to do.
It was late in the fall of 1879. Winter would soon be upon them, and it was crucial to find out if they could even make it to their destination.
So as they gathered at the crevice in the west wall of the Colorado River Gorge called the Hole in the Rock, which was deemed as the most appropriate place to establish a way down to the Colorado River, Silas S. Smith organized an exploring expedition led by his assistant Platt D. Lyman, with 12 other people along with my great-grandpa Riley.
Charles Walton joined a group of 12 other men who were sent on an expedition to drop down out of the hole and into the river below and then explore the canyons and the grounds beyond the river where they would land. After a week of searching and discovery, they returned, I think somewhat brokenhearted, as they reported what they had found. Deep canyons and gulches that were impassable by a team of horses. In fact, it was so bleak that it led Charles to say that not even a bird could fly over that country safely.
When Silas S. Smith heard the report of the 13 explorers, he, along with everyone else in the mission, faced a major dilemma. Do they go on, or do they give up and go home? Most of them had sold farms and homes and had very little to go home to, and the resources would be gone. It was too late to choose another route, yet how could they go on with the reports that they had just heard? Most of the explorers were satisfied that there was no use of the company going through that way, that the terrain east of the river was too difficult.
But the opinion of the explorers was not unanimous. 3 members of the group believed that with help from the territorial legislature and enough resources, this daring band of pioneers could construct a road through the labyrinth of slick rock, deep canyons, high buttes, and gorges. However, not one of the explorers was able to make it more than a few miles past the banks of the Colorado River, ensuring that the greater portion of their journey would remain a mystery.
Jens Nilsson proposed that the final decision be left to Silas S. Smith and the Lord.
That night must have been a very long night for Captain Smith as he wrestled with the decision of what to do. The next morning, the anticipation was undoubtedly high to hear what his decision would be. When he called the group together and asked them to sustain his decision to move forward, every hand went up, including those who had seen the country and thought it probably impossible to go forward.
It was at this time that Jens Nelson spoke up, and Jens said, "We must go forward whether we can or not." He also said in his Danish accent, "If we have plenty of stickety-tooty, we cannot fail." And I don't know if that became a slogan for the pioneers, but it certainly has for their descendants who often use it when there's difficult things to accomplish.
Stickety-tooty. I've heard that all my life. It means stick-to-itiveness. But in his thick accent, it came out stickety-tooty, and my mom taught me that word at a young age. Stick to your job until it's finished.
The decision was pretty clear. Continue on. So they made their way past 40 Mile Spring, past Carcass Wash. And Carcass Wash is kind of interesting because back in 1963, a group of scouts, 13 of them, lost their lives when the brakes went out on their vehicle as they were taking these kids out to go camping. It's just really a sad spot to visit. They made their way through Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and to 50 Mile Spring, a place that really provided them a lot of comfort and, of course, fresh water and a place to prepare to get down through the hole. There's some pretty cool arches in the area. And of course, Utah's known for arches. And I hope, again, you'll get out here and look around things. But they finally made their way to Hole in the Rock. And construction at Hole in the Rock was incredibly difficult. In this little video clip from a PBS documentary I did, you're going to see just how tough it was. There wasn't enough wood. There wasn't enough food for cattle. It was cold. Their food supplies were diminishing. I mean, everything that could go wrong was going wrong, and yet they persevered.
The next major obstacle in building the road down through the hole in the rock occurred at the first landing at the bottom of the first very steep descent, where they encountered a rock face that was so steep they referred to it as slanticular, probably greater than a 45-degree angle. It wasn't possible to even walk on it, let alone drive a wagon on it. It was left to Ben Perkins to determine how best to make a road over this slanticular rock ledge. What he ended up doing was tacking a road onto a nearly sheer cliff where no road could possibly be built. It was done by, first of all, carving into the rock a small shelf upon which the left wheels of the wagon would rest, and then below that shelf he drilled about a 4-inch hole every 18 inches or so, into which were driven oak stakes, on top of which were laid logs, sticks, brush, rocks, and dirt to hold the other wheel. His feat of engineering proved successful, and this is referred to still to this day as Uncle Ben's dugway. This particular project shows the great lengths that these pioneers went to be ingenious, to use every bit of knowledge they had, and to rely on inspiration from the Lord to accomplish the impossible.
From a distance, the hole in the rock looks much the same as it did when the pioneers first viewed it in the fall of 1879. However, upon closer examination, you can see the extensive amount of work that was put into making it accessible for the wagon train to descend. Originally, this was all the pioneers could see. The rest was solid rock with a 45-foot drop-off. So it was necessary for the pioneers to smooth out a grade so wagons could descend safely, while at the same time widening the gap. They started about here and began sloping the road downward and blasted this solid wall of rock. From the bottom of the 45-foot drop, the hole widened a bit, but the grade was very steep and the ground extremely uneven. And there were still places that needed to be widened in order for the wagons to pass through, such as this stretch in which you can still see how narrow the road became, a meager 70 inches to facilitate the average 58-inch width of a wagon and team.
When it was time to take the very first wagon down, it was proposed that Benjamin Perkins, the principal architect of Uncle Ben's dugway and the hole in the rock crevice, be given the honor to drive that wagon. However, he passed that honor on to his brother Hiram. Hiram attempted to take the wagon down, but his horses had too clear a view of that steep descent, and they absolutely refused to go. They tried another team with the same exact results. After 6 weeks of hard labor building this road down the hole in the rock, the teams refused to go down it. Then Joseph Barton had a suggestion.
Joe Barton stepped away from the group, harnessed his horses, and moved them into position at the opening of the hole in the rock. Barton stepped forward and he whispered into the ears of the horses. Then he climbed onto the seat of that wagon, snapped the reins, and the wagon and the horses started down the hole in the rock opening. It was a miraculous moment. The reason that was so miraculous was because a year earlier, Joe Barton's horses had contracted pink eye and were blind. I think those horses heard the voice of their master. They trusted him. And because of that, they had the confidence to step off that mountain. What an amazing, amazing story. I've often wondered if Joe Barton, a year earlier, complained to the Lord when his horses became blind. And since then, I've wondered how many times
He must have gone to the Lord afterward, thanking him that those horses were blind, for no other horse would have stepped off of that edge. That led the other horses to follow in suit and took those pioneers down through the hole in the rock.
Driving a wagon down the hole in the rock, that would have been a remarkable experience. Prior to their descent, they would remove the water barrels and anything that would stick out too far from the wagon so the wagon could pass through the narrower sections of the crevice. The initial descent, where they blasted out that 40-foot section, was extremely steep. Platt D. Lyman measured it at a 48% grade. So that initial descent required that they attach a rope behind the wagons, to which about 10 men held back as hard as they could on that rope to help slow the descent of the wagon. It was too slippery for the children and the women to walk, so they held hands and slid down to the first portion of the hole in the rock.
That's where I was hanging in the bucket.
Elizabeth Morris Decker wrote a letter to her parents. One vivid account that she had was of the descent down to the river. She said it'll scare you to death looking down a mile down to that river, 500-foot cliffs, barely room enough for a wagon to go down through. The first wagon that Elizabeth Decker saw, they had locked the brakes and had rough locked the back wheels. They'd stuck a post between the spokes so that it couldn't turn. And these 10 men were holding on to it. And as it went down the hill, Elizabeth thought it was just going to get plumb out of control, but they was able to go down and without any accidents. She said, "I will never forget that day." And as her and her young son, Willie, were walking down, Willie looked back and he started crying. And he asked his mom, "How are we ever going to get back home?" Little did Willie know this was going to be home. They weren't going to be able to go back to Parowan. The new home was going to be the San Juan.
About a third of the way down the crevice, after they had widened the top part wide enough so that they could bring wagons through, there was another place that had a sheer 50-foot drop. So Uncle Ben Perkins conceived the idea of tacking a road on the side of the cliff. It was almost a smooth road for them to drive their wagons across, and it was about 100 feet. There were 85 wagons that went safely across Uncle Ben's dugway, and many people said it was a miracle how it worked out, and it was the most impressive part of the whole road. Uncle Ben's dugway proved to be quite a feat of engineering.
Stanford and Arbella Smith had 3 children. They were one of the young couples that were supposed to go down the hole in the rock. Stanford had been helping all these wagons. So he got to looking around and he could not find his wagon, his children, or anybody there that belonged to him. He couldn't find them. So he took off and went back up the crevice net to see where his wife and children were. When he got up there, Arbella told him that the wagons were all down and theirs was the only one. He said, "We've got to take it down all by ourselves." Stanford and Arbella looked down that hole and he said, "Arbella, we can't do this. We've got to have at least 5 men to help us." She said, "No, we don't. I can do it." She took the 3 children and tucked quilts and stuff all around them, and she said, "Now you be okay till me and Papa come back, and you pray. All the while we're gone, you say your prayer." So Stanford told her to put the reins around her hands and pull back as hard as she could. Well, when the horses gave that first pull, she fell, and she was dragged down the hole in the rock. She got caught between some rocks and ripped her leg from her ankle up to her hip. Finally, they got down to the bottom of it. So Stanford went over to her and he said, will you be all right? And she said, you get back up there after those children as fast as you can. He took off, got up to the top, and that little Ada said, Papa, God was here with us while you were gone. Stanford finally got down to where our Bella was. Our Bella said, Stanford, look, there's 5 men coming. We've got help. We've got help. They said they'd come to help and all of that, and Stanford was very mad and ornery, and he said, no, we don't need any help with a wife like our Bella. She is all the help I needed.
You know, I often think about, when I think about what they went through, a show with John Wayne in it called The Big Trail, and they lowered these wagons down these cliffs. And this gives you a good indication of what it must have been like for those early pioneers who were going into Hole in the Rock. Let's watch.
You take Honey Girl from here on down, Dave. It's a little easier going. That's it. Now, Miss Ruth, you cling on to me. Put your arms around my neck, Honey Girl. A little tighter. A little tighter. Just a little tighter. I got the stick going there.
Well, it took them more than 6 weeks, which in and of itself is remarkable when you think about it, to chip their way, blast their way, build a road into the side of the mountain. You're going to be blown away when you hear about how they did this and how they created a wall and a road against that wall so that they could bring those 83-something wagons down that 2,000-foot drop-off. Keep in mind, they also had 2,000 head of cattle that they had to get to the bottom, not to mention the 83 families that had to get down there. That structure into Uncle Ben's dugway is absolutely incredible, and you can still see from this image here that we took just a couple years ago that you can still see the holes they dug into the sides of the rock as they chipped away to build that roadside. It is an absolute marvel to me what they did. Well, thinking they'd made it through the hole, they learned that that really wasn't the toughest part of the journey. And you can see from this trail map here where they had to go from that point as they made their way up Cottonwood Canyon, up the chute, all the way over to Slick Rock and down across the Clay Hill Pass to Comb Ridge. And Comb Ridge, they made their way down to San Juan Hill. In some places, they had to double up and triple up the horse teams just to get a wagon up the hill. And those horses would just fall to their knees. The blood remained on that sandstone rock for many years after the Hole in the Rock pioneers made their way through.
7 span of horses were used, so that when some of the horses were on their knees, fighting to get up to find a foothold, the still erect horses could plunge upward against the sharp grade. After several pulls, rests, and pulls, Many of the horses took to spasm and near convulsions. So exhausted were they. By the time most of the outfits were across, the worst stretches could easily be identified by the dried blood and matted hair from the forelegs of the struggling teams. My father was a strong man and reluctant to display emotion. But whenever, in later years, the full pathos of San Juan Hill was recalled, either by himself or by someone else, the memory of such bitter struggles was too much for him, and he wept.
It's amazing to me that they were able to do so much in such difficult circumstances with so little. To take a group of people like that and put them in those circumstances and to have them do as well as they did to solve insurmountable problems, that to me is the miracle.
Let's keep in perspective the reasons that these pioneers were originally called by church authorities to the San Juan mission. One was to act as a buffer between the outlaws that were there, the Native Americans that were there, and to establish a settlement that would accommodate future growth. This was not a quick fix. As law enforcement became more effective, there was less and less opportunity for hiding for these outlaws, and that kind of went away. The relations with the Native Americans improved, but in spite of efforts, there was still friction that lasted for decades. That really wasn't resolved until early in the 20th century.
Here in the Bluff Cemetery, where many of the hole-in-the-rock pioneers are buried, one may ask, why study history? What can we learn from these people? Gordon B. Hinckley, himself a descendant of Mormon pioneers, made this observation. It is good to look to the past, to gain appreciation for the present, and perspective for the future. It is good to look upon the virtues of those who have gone before, to gain strength for whatever lies ahead. Their tremendous example can become a compelling motivation for us all. So it is with the men, women, and children of the Hole-in-the-Rock expedition. Over and over they remained steadfast in the face of circumstances and conditions that seemed insurmountable. When there was no solution, they improvised. They used their skills, their creativity, and their courage. When confronted with the impossible, they made it possible. When things were hopeless, they were steadfast and fearless and never lost hope. They trusted in each other, exercised faith in a higher power, and never turned back.
From the book, one of my favorite quotes from Jane's diary is, "As the days drug on, the settlers pushed and pulled their teams and livestock over steep, slick rock formations that seemed to stretch for miles. Although the temperatures were cool, again, think about this, January, February, March, sweat poured down the faces of the men and women alike from the exertion that they were putting forth. The horses were giving out. Every horizon seemed like it was the last that they would conquer, only to see that there was another beyond that. When they hit San Juan Hill, that final challenge, they found it to be the steepest crossing on the journey. Again, they would load up 7 teams of horses just to pull one wagon up that hill. And as one horse fell to its knees, another would struggle to carry it along. It was the worst slope the men and women were forced to go over, but they beat it, and they conquered that San Juan Hill and made their way in to the Bluff Valley." And this is an image of what that area looked like going across the Comb Mountains and San Juan Hill. Can you imagine taking even a four-wheeler today across that? Most of that area is inaccessible by most four-wheelers, including some really heavy-duty equipment. Imagine doing that with horses and those tough old wagons with those hard wooden wheels bouncing along. Well, they made it into Bluff on April 6, 1880, and they decided, even though that wasn't their final destination by paper, that it was definitely going to be the place they stopped, and they set up camp, started planting crops, and started building homes. Today, if you get down into that Four Corners area of Utah, go to the Bluff Fort and you'll see things about my grandmother and grandfather that are there. Life kind of started to get a little better there. They moved from their homes in Bluff and made their way to Monticello. Now, in my book, you're going to read about some of the challenges they had with outlaw Indians and other kinds of things that went on that created some really intriguing stories for the book. Please make sure you pick up the book and read it. And listen, there's a bunch of choices. You can get it in a hardbound version through profilingevil.com, and you can even choose to get it signed if you'd like, or you can go on Amazon and get paperback, or you can get ebook for a whole lot less and be able to watch and read it that way. So a lot of choices in getting it. You're going to love the stories about Chief Posey, the special relationship that was built between Jane and Posey, and the way that Posey came to her defense when everything fell apart. You see, the thing that was really interesting is life in Bluff was pretty good, but they were called to move to Monticello, just to the north. It's about an hour drive nowadays, but it was still a pretty tough wagon ride back then. Once they settled in Monticello, they started putting their lives together again, planting crops, building houses, and developing a small community until the evening of July 24th, 1891, when my grandmother was suddenly murdered at a town celebration. Now, you're going to have to read the book to find out what happened there, and I really hope you do. But the thing that I found interesting is that I'd heard about this case my entire life. My grandfather used to talk about his grandmother who was killed. The case was never solved, and I kept thinking, I've spent my career looking at criminal cases. Why don't I look into this one? And so I did. It took about 10 years, but finally I found all the pieces to figure out who was responsible for murdering Jane. And the way it happened was pretty miraculous. And I think you're going to really get chills up and down your spine when you read that part of the book. So again, please go out and pick up She Knew No Fear. And you know what? I'm going to continue to celebrate Pioneer Days every single year and thank my lucky stars that it reminds me of my heritage. It reminds me who Jane is. And it reminds me how important it is to share family history with those that come behind us. You see, the statistics say that after 3 generations, things can be forgotten. We should never forget who our grandparents are, who our great-grandparents are, who our progenitors before and those who follow are. It is really important that we keep these histories alive so that people know about the greatness that runs within their veins. Hey, thanks for supporting Profiling Evil. And again, I hope you'll go out and pick up the book. You can find it at profilingevil.com, She Knew No Fear, or you can go to amazon.com. But have a great Pioneer Day if you're in Utah. And if you're somewhere else in the world, you probably have pioneer spirit in your families, people who have forged new ground, who have started new careers, who have changed their lifestyle. In fact, almost everyone is a pioneer in some way or another. And I hope that you make sure it's a good Pioneer weekend for you. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.